Have you ever been told you need to work on your empathy and thought that it was just something you were born with? Well, our guest today will have you thinking differently. Stay tuned for another great Bad Boss confession. Hi, I'm Beth Fahey, and welcome to Bad Boss Confessional. I've been a leader for over 30 years, and I'll tell you the truth, I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. The thing is, those mistakes taught me more about leadership than any success ever did. This podcast is where we get honest about the moments we'd rather forget and discover why they're actually the ones worth remembering. Each week, I talk to leaders who aren't afraid to share their worst boss moments and what they learned from them. Because here's what I know. Every great leader has a story they're not proud of. This is where we tell those stories. Our guest today is John McMahon, expert EOS implementer and a good friend of mine. I call John when I'm stuck because, as a really great coach, he's great at asking the right questions. Thanks so much for joining me here today, John. It's great to see you.
You are more than welcome. I have to say that I'm just thrilled to be here and support this little project you've got started and working on. I always admire your ambition to do interesting things, and I'm just grateful to be here.
Oh, thanks so much. So, for our listeners, I think it would be helpful to understand maybe a little bit about your life before you became an expert EOS implementer. What did you do before all this?
Well, mostly I was kind of an operations-oriented manager and leader. That's kind of where I cut my teeth, if you will. I actually have a master's degree in supply chain management from a local college here in Chicago. But I started at a fairly large privately held industrial supply company in Elmhurst, which will remain nameless for the time being. But it was an amazing experience as a young person coming out of college and getting an opportunity to start my career at a very successful and exceptionally well-run organization. Looking back on that experience years later, I got a chance to meet my wife there and learn a lot of skills that I took for granted, just about setting the bar high and achieving things. That was a pretty amazing experience. I did that for about 5 years or so. And then I moved on to a variety of different places, but eventually I wound up as an equity owner and a operations leader for a marketing services company in Wooddale, Illinois. That was kind of the start of my kind of real professional life, where I had multiple plants, hundreds of people, lots of responsibility for performance and other things, and it was that experience that over a 21-year period that kind of was the bulk of my education as a leader and a manager. For the most of that time, I had people that worked for me and that sort of thing. So it's been a lifelong kind of endeavor to try to learn from the mistakes that we're going to talk about, I'm sure, here in a few minutes.
So, were you a great boss right out of the gate?
No, no. In fact, like a lot of us, I would imagine, we learn by making the big mistakes. They kind of toss you in there. And the one thing I would say about that experience, my very first experience, was that they gave you a lot of responsibility pretty quickly, and they kind of wanted to see how you responded on your feet. So they were of the mindset. I didn't realize this at the time because I was young and inexperienced, but they were of the mindset that they were going to hire 10 people for their management development program, and they expected to have one come out the other end in 2 or 3 years. And so their weeding out process was quite intense. And so you would find yourself, if you were a finance expert or an educated young person, you'd find yourself running an operations department, or vice versa. They put you in different situations that would challenge you right away. And so it was really kind of trial by fire, which is where I got my first opportunity to learn.
Yeah. So, did that make you like more defensive, you think, at the beginning because you were just kind of muscling your way through, or?
No, I don't think so. Was pretty confident, young man at the time, and was going into it with eyes wide open. I have never been much for the backroom politicking and the impressions. And you've known me for a long time. You
Mhm.
probably would see that and agree with that. I don't spend a lot of time in the drama areas, and so I never really even paid attention to that. And so that was actually going on a lot around me. And I just was ignorant of it because it just never occurred to me to pay any attention to it whatsoever. So it was an interesting experience from that point of view. I was excited to be there, and it was a great job, really a great job for lots of different reasons. And anyway, it was a fun experience for sure.
Were there any lessons that you learned early on?
Yeah, the very first lesson, I've never forgotten it. I've carried it with me for 30 plus years as a leader and a manager, and I've titled it. So if you don't mind, I'm going to look down occasionally at my
Yeah.
notes. But my title for this is "What Took You So Long?" And the story essentially is this: about a year into my tenure there, I moved from the sales desk, which is where they were training all their, most of their young managers, and they put me in a department of 8 people, all men, all at least 10 years older than me at the age of, I think I was 23 or 24 at the time. And these are working class guys that are working in a packing department, and their job is to build wooden crates and specialized packaging for shipments of supplies that are going overseas. So I had a department of 8 people, and they handed me the keys to the desk and the roster for the team and said, you're responsible for these people. And that was kind of it. And I inherited, not that I'm deflecting blame here, but I inherited a guy who will remain nameless that had a chronic attendance problem. He just refused to show up. And when he did, he was kind of very lackadaisical in his work. And it was just really a difficult situation. And I really didn't understand at all the kind of impact it was having on his teammates and my tolerance of that. And so I worked with my manager, my boss, to say, hey, this is a problem. I don't know how. The guy had been there for 8 or 9 years. And so, long story short, we made the determination to let him go. And it took me like a week to work up the courage. It was a scary moment. We had back then the old perp walk where I had to go grab him off the floor and say, hey, I need to see you up in Terry's office. And everybody knew what was going on. I had to walk with him the entire length of the warehouse floor and up to the office. And he's laughing, and people are saying, see ya, see ya. And I'm turning around thinking to myself, what is going on here? And he put his arm around me as we got to the door, and he said, what the hell took you so long? And I'm like, what? Here I've been stressing about this conversation. And he said, dude, I've wanted this for like 2.5 years. You finally had the courage to do something about it. And so my lesson there after that was all over was, most of the time in those situations and others, the fear of or the anticipation of a difficult conversation is almost always worse than the conversation itself. That was my lesson. I'll never forget it, because they know, right? Employees know when they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And in this case, we had a very generous severance policy. So there was almost an incentive for people to not want to quit if they didn't like what they were doing. And so that was really the first lesson that I had. Not necessarily a mistake that I made necessarily, other than tolerating it for too long. But
To be fair, if you were 23 years old, I just worked with a team of a lot of greenhorns, let's just say, on the team. And we were really struggling to solve an issue, a people issue. And, this is a person that was the right person. There just wasn't a seat anymore. And that's always really tough, right? Because you like the person, they fit in with the culture, but when there's not a seat, in a for-profit company, you can't keep them around. And so they struggled. I mean, we were on this issue for about an hour. And then finally, I kind of pulled the room and I went around and I said, have you ever fired anyone? No. Have you ever fired anyone? No. Have you ever fired anyone? No. And it's the fear of having the conversation that was keeping them stuck from making a decision. So, yeah.
yeah, the fear is real. I mean, I don't think I slept well for like the whole week, once I got all the file in place and everything else. And the way that we did it, the way we were coached to do it, let the guy come in, punch the clock, and then get him off the floor and take him to the personnel office, right? That's the term they were still using back then. So that I'm dating myself. That whole thing was goofy. I mean, why would you ever want to, embarrass another human being or two in that process? But it was a bizarre situation. He was happy with the outcome. And here I was just totally not necessarily stressed, but just tense, right?
Mhm.
Everywhere in my voice and in my
Mm.
physical person, just stressed about the whole thing. And then he just, with that simple question, like, what the hell took you so long? It just kind of like popped the balloon. I was like, thank God this is going to be a lot easier than I expected. And then they obviously don't always go that way.
Yeah. Yeah, your title, I have to say, was not a spoiler alert because I didn't see that coming.
Just like me, I didn't see it coming either. And like I said, I've remembered it forever, and I've coached my leaders and my managers over the years. Like, listen, I know you're stressed about this, and I use that story all the time. Like, this is my first experience as letting someone go from a job. We are all hung. All that stuff is in our own head. That's the story we're making up most of the time, especially if we've done what we recommend doing in Great Boss and other things. Is like, these things should not come as a complete surprise to people if we're doing our job well and communicating expectations back and forth, which is that in itself is hard. But
So carry me a little more forward in your career as a boss. Are there any other stories that you have about, how you developed and grew? Because that's kind of like a greenhorn story. Everybody sort of has to get through that period of time. But what did you start to discover about yourself as a boss as you evolved?
well, one thing that I've learned, and I learned this is a painful lesson that I still attempt to remember from time to time. Once I had an opportunity to run or be responsible for a multifaceted organization with some higher level people that reported directly to me, director levels and above. I had one particular woman that was just super capable in her role. She had kind of risen up through the ranks over the years. And so she knew a lot about her particular discipline, didn't know a ton about a lot of the other areas that she ultimately became responsible for. But the relationship that I developed with her was one that was awkward for me because I couldn't quite connect with her. And I didn't understand why until much later after the relationship kind of ended, which is my biggest regret, I think, as a manager is this thing here. And it was really just the idea that whenever we would work together and talk in our conversations, she would mostly be talking about things that were not going well, people that were not performing, other departments that couldn't do what they were supposed to do. And I kind of developed this kind of bias about her demeanor that kind of judged her and categorized her as the chronic complainer.
Mhm.
And so I found myself over the year or so, that more than that, actually, a couple of years that we worked together, that I just started mostly defending the people that or the things that she was trying to get
Mhm.
me to see weren't operating well. And that just irritated the heck out of her. I mean, but I couldn't quite understand, well, why can't you see the good intentions here? And what I've learned from that, unfortunately, a little too late, was that she wasn't complaining. She just wanted to be heard. She just
Mhm.
needed to be heard. And my empathy skill at that time in my career was just not where it needed to be. I didn't recognize it. I couldn't just be there in her pain and ask her how I could help. And I think since I've become an implementer and been coached on this many ways and from many really capable people, I didn't have the curiosity muscle. So I didn't have the ability to say, I wonder what's really going on with her and why she's bringing this to me. I should just ask an open ended question here, like, hey, tell me about how that's making you feel or why this is a problem for us, or any of the other questions that we would now normally ask our teams, right? Just being empathetic, being there in the moment. We don't have to fix it, right? We don't have to fix it. And we certainly shouldn't be defending it unless it's required. But that lesson, unfortunately, was one that I think I keep reminding myself and need to remember, even today, because that's sometimes what people need most of all.
Yeah. I know you were here when I introduced you. And I said, you're really great at asking the right questions. So tell me about that. Because if that wasn't a skill set of yours in the beginning, how did you get better at it?
Great question. I think I've just tried to continue to work it and recognize and be present in the moment when there's stuff to talk about and recognize when I ask a closed-ended, non-curiosity based question, which happens, right? Even today, when I'm keenly and acutely aware of it, I oftentimes find myself stopping after I've asked a yes or no, or, for lack of a better way of describing it, a closed-ended question, which doesn't lead anywhere other than just silence, which isn't productive. At least that kind of silence isn't productive. And I'll stop and I'll just say, hey, I'm really sorry. I just asked a really boneheaded question because it led us right into the end of the alley. What I really want to know is, why are we feeling this way, or what's going on with us, and try to reframe it and just kind of recognize in the moment that I've just kind of backed myself into a corner, apologize for that, and try to recast the same question in a different way. And I think that has helped me be more intuitive with asking those open-ended, curiosity-based questions from the get-go.
I'm just curious, how do people react when you reframe like that live in the moment?
Yeah, good curiosity-based question. The way they typically react most of the time, you know what? Actually like to go back and answer it in two different ways. At first, the story you tell yourself in that moment is that I'm looking like an idiot. But what you learn is that that level of vulnerability, even though it isn't really deep, is really important and valuable to the people that you're communicating with. And that buys and has bought me a lot of credibility, because I am not the smartest guy on the planet. And so that skill helps, right? It builds rapport, it builds connection, and we can screw a lot of things up in the room as implementers. And we do, right? I mean, that's how we learn, is we make
Mhm.
mistakes. We try to help each other avoid those where we can with sharing and whatever else. But I think that level of vulnerability that's kind of where it starts there. Where you're like, oh boy, I don't want to go back on that. But recovering from that, I think, is a skill that we learn as we get further and further along on our journey, right? And not being too hard on ourselves in those moments.
Do you find that when you reframe and ask the second part of the question, when you're really trying to get more curious, that they're almost leaning in and wanting to help you because they can see what you're doing, right? People can break down what's happening as it's happening, and they kind of see the wheels turning. What I've found is, and I'll just do a quick experience share, is that when I get curious, people see what I'm doing. They're kind of mentally taking notes and then wanting to help almost even more fill in the gaps.
I would agree with that. I think the thing that was in my head as you were explaining that, the danger that we have to avoid in those cases, for me in particular, because I'm a seven fact finder, is there's a very, very fine line between curiosity for curiosity's sake and curiosity for what the team needs, knowing whether or not they're this piece of information is going to help me understand the context or actually the language that they're using, right? That's not relevant. That's not important. Me understanding this language or this term is not as important as understanding why this is an issue in front of the team right now, right? So there's a different level of curiosity I have to be very careful of, right? And what
Mhm.
I find sometimes, the asking questions, if I ask a decent question, but maybe not the best question, oftentimes I'll find that the answers come back to me. And that's when I'll know maybe that wasn't the best question to ask, because they think I want to know the answer. I don't want to be vested with this answer. I want them to
Mhm.
be curious themselves about why we're having this conversation at the moment. So I'm now starting to look for resonance when there's silence after a good question. If they don't jump to immediately respond, generally that's a pretty good question.
This is like a master class in asking great questions, by the way, which is something that I'm always trying to get better at myself. It actually was a theme for the year for me once.
I understand. It's really easy, I think, I've found in coaching other people, especially our colleagues. It's very easy in a I don't what's the right way of describing it. I don't want to say non-important situation because that's not what I want to say. But when you're out of when you're out of the immediacy of the conversation with the person you're speaking with, it becomes much easier to ask open-ended questions than it is in the moment. And I think it's the listening skill that really needs to be developed over time. Listening to understand first before you reply, having confidence that your brain will catch up with the audience or what the person needs from you. It's a skill that most of us don't have very well. We don't do it very well, and that I think it starts there.
Yeah, I think I've heard this said before about listening. Are you listening and just waiting for the moment for you to respond? Or are you listening in order to understand actually what the person is saying at a deeper level? And that is, something that I've tried coaching my kids on. I've coached myself many times on that. I've coached leadership team members on it. And it is very difficult to remember that when you're a person who likes information.
Guilty as charged. And one of the things I learned from you and Renee, I'm sure you have the data committed to memory about the percentage of communication that takes place with our words and the auditory versus the body language versus the tone, right? Only a small percentage of the message is actually in the words themselves, but that's really all most of us are listening for when that person speaking the words is done, so we can jump right in. But when you're doing a good job of listening, you're paying attention to the body language and the tone, and you can't respond
Mhm.
immediately if you're paying attention to all that at the same time. You shouldn't be able to respond, I don't think, as quickly as if you're just ignoring all that. Like, why is she looking like that? Right? I was like, what's
Yeah.
that all about?
I mean, what I've learned how to do, because I wasn't very good at it before I became an implementer either, was talking about what I'm seeing. Our good friend Dr. Dino would say, holding up the mirror to the situation at hand. I'm just seeing the body language has shifted in the room. I don't see anyone making eye contact at this point. Things like that, that then people can respond to because that body language means so much. I just had that this week with a team, and I could tell there was one person there that was checked out. And I said, hey, just an observation. It looks like you're not very interested in what's going on here today. And I'd just like to learn a little bit more about that. Would you be willing to share? And that was a breakthrough moment for the team. Sometimes as a boss, it's just that holding up the mirror idea.
That's great. I'm curious, as you were articulating that, when you do that well, sounds like you get the result that you just described. When you make the observation about what you're seeing and then you don't follow up well, what typically happens to you? What's your kind of default? I should have put that one too far.
Hmm. Well, what I've learned to do lately, and I mean very recently, is just let silence do the heavy lifting. And I used to fill it in with words. And if somebody would look down or like, oh my God, she's talking, I don't want her to talk to me. Oh my God. And you can tell, and you want to relieve them of their pain. And sometimes we just, well, all right, so let's just get back to the rocks that we were setting or whatever, something tactical, because we all want relief in that moment. But it's very hard to sit in the silence, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what I was kind of hoping you were going to say, because I find that my biggest mistake when I ask good observation questions. Hey, I'm just curious. This is what I'm seeing. I tend to just keep my mouth running. Bad idea, right? Don't keep your mouth running. Just make the observation. Don't make a judgment statement after that.
So do you know what somebody gave me a tip that helped me a ton, and maybe this will help the listeners out there, is that when you do something like that and you make an observation, especially about the body language or the behavior, is ask the question and then count to 7, because 7 seconds is about as long as people can stand without words. So I'm trying to make the point that it started to get uncomfortable when I didn't talk just now, right? The idea is that people will jump in if you stay silent. And sometimes in my head, it sounds terrible, my poor clients, if they're listening to this, but sometimes I'm just like, "Let them squirm, let them squirm." You have to let them, because this is a breakthrough moment, and if I keep jumping in, or if you as a boss keep jumping in to save your direct report from, you know, revealing the root cause of the issue, and you're never gonna get anywhere.
Right. Yeah, the 20/80 rule is really good, or the 80/20 rule, depending on how you look at it, right? If you're doing 80% of the talking in a
Yeah.
conversation with your direct report or with your team, chances are we're not making the progress, or they're not making the progress that they should be. And that's not good. We'll say though that when we're making observations about what we're seeing, it's really important that we don't get, and I take this from David Lewis, who taught this in his many of his workshops. We can't get married to the answer, right? We can't make a prejudgment. We have to check the assumptions. In other words, I'm sensing that you might not be down with this conversation, or you're kind of checked out. Well, that assumption could be completely wrong,
Mhm.
right? Just because you saw it doesn't mean you're seeing it correctly. So you
Mhm.
can't get too married to their answer. If they come back and say, "No, no, no, this is a really great conversation. I'm just being really focused."
Mhm.
All right, great. Then we move on.
There've been countless times that I've been barking up the wrong tree too. And, I'll say things like, "Well, you guys, apparently you're all checked out. You're not hearing anything that I'm saying," because I look out and sometimes I just see what I perceive to be eyes glazed over. And they're like, "No, this is great. This is just what we need." And I'm, "Oh, okay." But we always go to scarcity, don't we? Right?
It's the way it works. It's the way it works.
Yeah, totally. Well, this is really interesting about questions. I didn't think this is where the conversation was going, but it is one of my favorite topics, because I know that I'm not very good at it either. And you know, it's a skill we can all learn. I mean, think about where you can employ this. It's not just at work, it's not just with your direct reports, but with your kids, with your spouse, with, anybody that you have a relationship with. Getting good at asking questions, it actually deepens the relationship.
It can, right? It could all, in some cases, though, the other thing you have to be mindful of, or I have to pay attention to, is that occasionally when you're working or talking or speaking with people that kind of have a little bit of insight as to what you're trying to accomplish, sometimes you can really kind of tick them off. Like, don't you EOS me? Why are you asking me that question? I know why you're doing that, right? So you have to be a little bit mindful of that.
It's not like I haven't heard that before, John. You should have seen the New Year's Day that I pulled out the flip chart to take the whole family through our, living trust.
Yeah, right, right.
And it was like, "Mom, there's football on." I'm like, anyway, yeah, I've heard that thrown at me a couple of times. As an implementer, we're in a really interesting position, right? We get to see behaviors and the way people interact with each other. And have you ever had, I mean, without revealing anybody's name, but have you ever had some real breakthroughs with your clients in regards to their own empathy? Because I sometimes I really empathize with some of my visionary clients who are just like, they're sort of crazy and, breaking things, and, we'll figure it out as we go. And meanwhile, they're kind of stepping all over everybody's feelings as they do it. And I'm just curious if you've seen some real growth on your teams.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I'd have to contemplate the specific example, and there isn't one that's coming straight
Mm,
to my mind that ends in a positive outcome
mhm.
necessarily. I did have an experience where I did not. I had sensed that there was something up with the visionary at the beginning. It was very early on in my journey as an implementer, and I probably had done maybe less than 10. annual sessions at that point, and we were doing team health. So I'd work with the team. I think this was like our sixth or seventh session, something like that. So it wasn't a brand new team. So I knew them fairly well. But when we finished that exercise, I sensed there was something up at the check-in with the visionary in particular. And I checked out. I'm like, you know what? Or chickened out. I, I can't. That it sounds. I should have said something, but I didn't. Like
Mm.
we got too much to do, right? So when you're first getting started, you're kind of rushing through. You don't want to miss the most important part of the day. We're finished with the one thing feedback, so we've actually like concluded on all that, and then it's time to kind of restate our one thing commitments based on the feedback that we've gotten from our team. And the visionary couldn't do it, and he put his head down and he kind of closed his book up and he said, I just got to say that I've just come to the realization that I don't I don't really like working with other human beings.
Mm.
I would much rather just be in the room writing the code. That's
Mm.
what got us here. And I don't know that I can do this. And that was the end of that conversation and day. We stumbled along through some of the rest of the day, and then that was kind of it for both the session and of the client. That was the last time I was in the room
Mm.
with them. And I probably couldn't have changed that outcome no matter what I had done at check in. But I think that realization, hopefully, I lost touch with him after a while. That realization hopefully helped him get where he needed to go.
Yeah.
So probably not exactly a topic that is related to your question, but that's the only thing that came to my mind.
I think what you're exposing there is what I call the choice. And when you told your story about the woman you were working with that you couldn't connect with, and she's telling you all these things that weren't working, after the fact, you realized, and after the fact, you did something about it, right? You changed your behavior. And sometimes this isn't like a lightning bolt, I think, and we don't change overnight or realize what the issue is. But after getting the same feedback from many different sources over time, you start to weave together what it is that you need to be working on. And I mean, I know for me, it came in my 50s. It didn't come right away when it needed to happen, 10 or 15 years earlier. So my hope is sometimes when you have a situation like you had with that client, that maybe that did end up being a good story in the end for that person. Because if they're in so much pain doing that, then maybe they should move on and find the next thing. I mean, we get one precious life, right?
Right. Yeah, I think you're spot on. The lessons sometimes, oftentimes, are not lightning bolts. They're not. We call those things ahas. Like, hey, it's an aha. Well, you know what? Most of the time, that stuff comes days, weeks, months, even years later. As your to your
Hmm.
point, right?
Yeah.
It takes the universe to line up in certain ways for us to connect the dots, and that's just the way the life works, right? It's not a linear algorithm. It just
Yeah.
doesn't work that way.
So I would love to know if we can just abruptly change the subject. So, what do you do for fun, John?
What do I do for fun? I am a pretty committed and dedicated amateur athlete, I would say. I ride a bicycle quite a bit, as you probably remember, working out all the time and kind of focused on trying to be in the top end, in terms of overall fitness for old people, right? Quick story, I was coming riding up the elevator about a year ago, and some young kid's like 30 years old. He's coming out of the gym with me, and he said, "Man, you were going at it pretty hard. What are you training for?" I said, "Old age." And he's like, "Yeah, pretty funny, but that's the truth, right? That's kind of what I do for fun. I have two young granddaughters that are a lot of fun. Unfortunately, I don't live locally, so we get a chance to travel with them, and we do a lot of skiing in the wintertime. And so it's a lot of outdoor athletic type stuff for fun, is kind of my go-to stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I love the outdoors too, as you know. So it's nothing like getting some fresh air and getting outside and getting those endorphins.
The other day, I was coming back from an exercise class that I take sometimes at 5:30 in the morning, and there was a guy there that was on a treadmill, and I'm just thinking to myself, why would you ever do that on a treadmill inside? It's like 60 degrees outside right now. It's like the perfect time to do that, but some people are they just like doing it inside.
Yeah. Well, we talked before we started recording about what a beautiful day it is here in Chicago. It's, the end of summer, but it's a nice, cool day. And I'm sure you're going to go out for a ride or something after this. Hang tight. We'll be right back with our conversation with John after a word from our sponsors. Let's be honest, hiring the right people is hard. That's why I love Titus Talent Strategies. Their whole person hiring approach helps you find and keep A players who align with your values, and they back it with an industry leading guarantee. Best part? Titus Talent Strategies is included in the entrepreneurial toolkit for companies running on EOS. Check them out at titustalent.com/EOS. Do you love running on EOS? Try Streti, the EOS platform people love. Native integrations and extra features help you manage people, projects, process, and engagement. Connected to your favorite EOS tools and all in one place. You love EOS. It's time to love the platform you're running it on. Try Streti free at streti.com. That's STRETY.com. Streti, the EOS platform people love. And now back to my conversation with John. I have one last question for you, and this is something that I ask all of my guests. So, if you were to get a tattoo somewhere on your body, I don't know if you have tattoos or not, John, but if you were to get a tattoo to remind you maybe something about questions or empathy, some of the subjects that we talked about today, what would it be and where would it be located?
Oh, the location question. What would it be? My gut reaction would be let it be,
Mm,
would be what I would get, just simple words. And I probably would put it on probably right here on my left inside forearm so that I could see it fairly often to remind
mhm.
myself of it's time to let stuff go, right? Quit
Yeah.
hanging on to it. That would be probably my go-to.
Yeah. Well, I learned so much today, as I always do, talking to you, and I really do enjoy our conversations. Thanks so much for sharing your story. I know it's not easy to share these stories, especially, in a podcast format, but I think more than almost anyone I know, you understand the power that vulnerability brings and how it just helps us be more human. And you're one of my favorite humans. So thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. I agree with the vulnerability part. It's been a very great afternoon. I've been looking forward to being here, and the feeling is definitely mutual.
Awesome. Many thanks to John McMahon for sharing his great insights on the art of asking questions and getting curious. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear this. Thanks for listening to Bad Boss Confessional. We'll see you next week.